So I like to start off my talks with a little bit of a disclaimer. None of this presentation is meant to blame or shame. So we all exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we've all caused wounds or harm, whether intentional or not intentional. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know, but also we won't find all the answers in the course of today's presentation, but we have the right to learn and start somewhere and contribute to growing. So I'll talk a little bit about my lab, which is the Thrive Discovery Center. So it is the home of the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center. We have a breast milk biorepository with over 2,000 samples from around the globe, and we pair this with administrative data. We have several cohort studies, and it is the home or the hub of the International Milk Composition or IMiC Consortium, which we'll hear about today. And we also conduct a series of clinical trials. We have a foundational bedrock of values and approaches that underlies all of our research. I like to say that our lab members each contribute a unique thread to the fabric that overlies all of what we do. I'm a certified inclusion professional, so health equity is a focus of all that we do. Here are some of our new studies that are ongoing globally. And we're really looking at changing from observation to impact. And I know this is an innovation conference, but I think it's not enough to do cool science. As I said in the panel talk, innovation for innovation's sake is a bit of a dangerous thing, so we want to make sure that we're having impact for our stakeholders. And I co-direct the lab with my colleague, Megan Azad. So what does it mean when we're leading for equity? So it means that we make inequities visible, we disrupt the discourse, and the practices and policies that perpetuate inequities. I like to call myself a bit of a research rebel, and we reimagine new ways to engage and design, and do this with communities. So what is liberatory design? It's an approach we can use to work towards equity, and I want to highlight that it's an outcome and a process. So it's not just an outgame, an endgame, it's an iterative process. And when we want to use liberatory design, and what is it? So it creates designs that help us increase opportunities for those that are most impacted by a situation. So as I said in the panel talk, those who are most impacted by a problem, a situation, should be closest to power. And that's actually very rarely the case. And it allows us to transform power by shifting the power balance in relationships. And it gives us increased agency, or our stakeholders increased agency. And so when do we want to use it? When we want to learn more about those people who are most impacted by a situation or problem. And when we want to see deeper than statistics. We've talked a lot about AI, and people are wondering, how do we maintain the human element of this? And liberatory design is actually a way to do that. And when we want to build relational trust to create space for deep listening, not just learning, but deep listening. So you have to listen actively and deeply in order to learn. And so it builds a strong foundation. It allows us to see systems of oppression that are at play in our environments. It's engaging people within our system, and it allows us to take action and learn along the way. And so this is what the liberatory design process looks like, and we'll go through it a little bit. But at the center, you can see it's notice and reflection. So rather than action, it's noticing and reflecting. So we'll use a bit of a case study. The International Milk Composition Consortium, which I co-direct, was established in 2020 to unite maternal child health and human milk research with statisticians to co-develop a harmonized approach to milk analysis. It's 1,200 mother-infant dyads in 4 diverse settings. So we have Canada, Tanzania, Pakistan, and Burkina Faso. And it's collecting information about nutritional and non-nutritional growth, and it's critical to understanding why some breastfed infants fail to achieve optimal growth and how to optimize nutrition for infants who can't be breastfed. And Mariana did an excellent job about outlining the importance of breast milk. It's funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it is the largest investment to date in breastfeeding research. And so, again, Mariana built a great case for breastfeeding, but in some countries, up to 20% of child mortality is caused by suboptimal breastfeeding. And so why does this matter? In Pakistan, for example, 60% of infants by 6 months will experience growth faltering, or stunting. In Burkina Faso, preterm infants without a wet nurse die. So this does have a huge impact. And so we have IMiC here. So we have a series of interventional studies. Some are nicotinamide-based, a BEP supplement, and we're looking at maternal factors. So this is one system. So nutrition, infection, stress, so environmental factors, as we call them, across the 4 diverse settings. And then we're looking at milk compositions. So everything from human milk oligosaccharides, macronutrients, micronutrients, proteomics, metabolomics, targeted and untargeted, microbiome. We're really running the gamut. And then we're taking questionnaire data, and with our data science partners at Berkeley and Stanford, they're doing the machine learning, which we've heard a lot about, and they're modeling growth outcomes and trajectories for us using all of this data, so bringing it all together. So really innovative and exciting stuff. And here's our governance structure. So you can see we've got an external advisory committee with people who are the foremost in their field, driving the science and kind of guiding us in the right way. Megan and myself are co-directing. We have our Gates program officer, field site leads, laboratory leads, data scientist leads. It's a huge consortium to pull this off. So great innovation, amazing work that we're doing. I think it's a cool study, but let's look a little further. So 100% of Gates-funded intervention studies take place in LMICs. 99% of the funding is held in high-income countries. Startling statistic. They're working to change that, but if I go back to this governance structure, there's no LMIC leads. There is nobody from an LMIC anywhere within this governance structure. And not only that, all of the LMIC-based academic institutions involved in the study are paired with and receive direction from a high-income academic institution. Can you imagine if somebody came into your NICU tomorrow, into your academic institution and said, I'm going to tell you how to do your work? It would be insulting, but this is the way that we design studies. So I noticed some of these inequities, and I thought, we got to change this. And so an environmental scan of IMiC and low-middle income-based research was conducted in 2022. So we did a landscape analysis. We did some conversational interviews using open-ended questions and literature reviews, and here's what we found. So there's major power imbalances between high-income and low-middle-income settings. And there's a paternalistic relationship between high-income and low-middle-income countries and academic institutions. So again, that partnership where we're kind of, you have to pair with us and we're going to tell you how to do this research. And then there's unaligned research interests. So who decides what gets researched? It's actually high-income investigators, because what's going to get funded, what's going to get published, right? That's how we design some of these studies. And the research questions are based on high-income countries' literature reviews, and then we're trying to impose those research questions on an LMIC environment. And again, the power imbalance disproportionately advantages the high-income researcher and their interests. And this goes even from a budget perspective, right? If we're trying to fund our postdocs or our RAs, it's like they want to be fairly paid for their work. And then there's like a budget for the LMIC field site workers or the whole LMIC field site dynamic. And it's like, well, how cheaply can we do that? And that's just wrong. And then intervention studies are favored. So there's an assumption that we need an intervention without actually discovering what the gap is. There's inequitable access to information. So again, even to do a literature review in an LMIC, if it's behind a paywall, they can't access it. Data is the same thing when we were talking about data access today. And there's language barriers. So interestingly, we all need ethics to move our studies forward. And if somebody said to me, well, you need to translate all of your ethics to another language, I would say, well, that's a big undertaking. It has to be validated. We have to pay somebody to do that. Well, in Burkina Faso, English is not the first language, and therefore their ethics are in French. And nobody thought anything of saying, well, we need you to translate your ethics to English so we can get approval. They're already overburdened, and somebody in the field site actually had to translate those ethics for us. And so while it's inconceivable to us in a high-income country, we're asking overburdened LMICs to do this. A really interesting finding is that we, as high-income researchers, have an opportunity to learn from LMIC researchers. So often we think we're going to impart knowledge, we're going to save the day. We have just as much or more to learn from them. And so key questions to ask yourself when you're engaging these things: who's most impacted by the challenge that we're focused on? Who has access to the decision-making power? And how can we build relationships instead of this transactional drop-in, we'll fund a little bit of something and pull out. And how might an individual's experiences affect how they're seen or level of trust between us? And how might we maintain the stance of learning as opposed to solving and fixing? So it's a foundational mindset. It starts with focusing on human values. We research with, not on people. And it's building relational trust. So relationships move at the speed of trust. And that's not attractive to funders, right? You have a funding timeline, we'll throw more money at it, you have to publish, you need results, you need to move at the speed of trust. And so where do you start? Again, informal conversation, one-on-one interviews, anecdotal stories, and focus on getting the stories first, not the solution. We often want to jump to the fix, right? So you hear a little bit and it's like, oh, I have a fix for that. Listen, take the time to listen. And practice self-awareness. So who we are determines how we design. Again, we all have biases, we all have ways of learning, of knowing, of being, and we bring those into our study design. And so we need to acknowledge and challenge our assumptions. We need to discover what we don't know and ask what's unfamiliar to me and lean into what's familiar as opposed to staying with what we think we already know. And ask how your identity, so your race, your class, your gender, any other identifier, positions you in society, because you will have privilege and power within that dynamic. And how might that impact other people in the process? And so we need to recognize the systems of oppression that are at play in our environment. And that could be in the research field, the academic, in medical practice. And so ideologies of supremacy and dominance that exist, so it can be economic, political, cultural beliefs, norms and values, and they actually perpetuate disparities. And so here are some levels of systematic oppression, and some of these look awful. And you might think, well, I don't believe in that. That's not me. But this is a really interesting quote. One does not understand systems or structures by looking at intent. So intent is irrelevant here. Instead, we have to examine what they actually do, how they operate, and what the outcomes are. Certainly, a system or structure could be established for the purpose of excluding or discriminating. However, most structures produce inequitable outcomes without intent. So we often don't intend to do harm or perpetuate the inequities. And so if we think about those systems of oppression that I listed, here's how it might play out in our academic environment or our research environment, our medical environment. So I'm up here presenting to you today as a PI of the study. Why am I presenting instead of an LMIC investigator? When we have budgets for research, well, there's always trips involved for conferences, et cetera. Who goes on field site visits? It's the high-income investigator that's going to the field site. Why don't we bring low-middle income trainees, investigators to the high-income environment to observe? Why are we not investing in that? It might be, that we have additional equipment that's being produced or purchased for the high-income investigator. Why are we not investing in low-middle income labs? So again, it's who is the face of this, who gets the credit for it, who's on the publications, and so all of these things exist. It's very hierarchical. So how do we break those barriers? And so we need to explore these structures and look for opportunities where we can change that power balance and share it. And why? So, people who have a greater sense of agency and feel that there's buy-in, it produces better outcomes. Another reason to do it, just as a quick, example, we were collecting colostrum for IMiC. It was an add-on by the Gates Foundation. And, they said, well, you've got 2 sites that are still collecting, so there should be no problem. We asked, the PI in the high-income setting, and that was fine in Burkina Faso. In Pakistan, we actually couldn't, because there are cultural barriers that meant we couldn't access the mothers for the first 72 hours. And so it was a huge gap. And because we had the fix, we actually wasted resources, we wasted time, and nobody thought to check, right, and give agency to the field sites. So pause and reflect on dynamics. Who's most impacted? Again, do they have power to transform the situation? We can co-create protocols with these individuals rather than just thinking we have the fix, and ask, to what extent does our design transform power, and how do we know this? And embrace complexity. So it's messy. So I talked about the amount of funding that exists in high-income countries, and you might think, we'll just give it to the low-middle-income country. That makes the most sense. Well, in something like Burkina Faso, for everything they import, there's a 50% tax, which means 50% of their grant money would actually be gone in taxes. So what we do actually is split the budget so that the high-income country is purchasing the consumables for sample collection, et cetera, and then we donate it to the country. Similarly, if they're buying ELISAs, et cetera, they can't buy 1 or 2 kits. They have to buy in volume. So there are some things where it makes sense to split budgets, split resources. So it's not a simple linear fix, A to Z, and it takes a team approach to change these things. And so again, there's that urgent pressure to quickly fix something, and it's often ineffective results. It's not a good business investment, even if we want to look at it in dollars and cents, and we're perpetuating inequities. And so we need to acknowledge that confusion and discomfort and lean into it a little bit. And so this is a typical linear system, and this is how we do things. We see that there's an urgent need for change. Somebody decides somewhere along the line that they have a fix, probably somebody in power, and then they implement it from the top down. People are irritated and there's a lack of buy-in. It's not successful because they didn't stop to ask the right people in the first place, the stakeholders, and then cynicism deepens, right? And then it's like, well, we've had research done here before, like, it doesn't work. You could talk about it also, this is another way of looking at the top-down approach. Some people call it white saviorism. I'll call it brown saviorism. I'm not even white. High-income saviorism. An example, we were, talking to the Burkina Faso team. Breast milk is temperature sensitive, needs to be stored at -80. We're collecting 400 samples. They're like, we'll ship it to you every couple of weeks. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Like, ship them once you finish collection. And they said, well, we don't have freezer space. And I'm like, no problem, we'll buy you another freezer. They didn't want another freezer. And I'm like, why not? Well, it turns out they have intermittent power. And so their freezer is powered by a generator. And when the generator goes down, somebody's cycling a bike to keep the generator going, to keep the samples cool, right? So something, I didn't even know what I didn't know, and I thought I had the fix. That's how simple it is, right? And so these are the things that you learn around the way. And, we never thought to ask. And so when we look at a liberatory system, there's an urgent need to change, but we stop and learn and we ask the questions first. And we don't just stop at the questions, we engage the people throughout the process. So they have agency and ownership, and we're increasing capacity. And then we get that buy-in, and there's a transfer of power so that I, as the PI, no longer hold the power. But those LMIC stakeholders, there's expertise there, they're participants, they hold the power. And now you have buy-in. And so this is another way to look at it. We're working together. And so, it's prototyping. It's not a pass-fail. So we might try something, and it might not work, but we're going to learn along the way. And I think too often in medicine and research, we're dealing in absolutes. So make that space to pass or fail. And how can we take action? So we can co-create our experiments with learning as the goal, not a fix as the goal. We can build that safe-to-fail space and reflect. So think prototyping and proof of concept as opposed to solution. And so this takes us back to this liberatory design graphic, and you can see how it is circular, and we're noticing and reflecting along the way. And so what are we changing in what we're doing? Because I don't want to just talk about it. We actually got to implement some change. So we have now developed an LMIC engagement and capacity exchange framework, and that's based on our environmental scan, and that's now being implemented across all Gates Foundation funded research. We now have, thankfully, LMIC representation at all levels of governance within IMiC. There is an LMIC working group, which is led by LMIC investigators, not high-income country investigators. We have a seasonality working group that's been formed. A huge gap in the cool, innovative research was looking at food scarcity, growth cycles, disease burden, and so we're now integrating that into our machine learning. We're giving a lunch and learn later this month to the Gates Foundation, and I'm co-presenting with LMIC field workers and investigators. They're giving their lived experience in their own right, and I actually hope one day that I don't need to be there, and they'll be able to just present without me. And then Denbalo is a spin-off of IMiC, and again, it's self-governed by LMICs. They have a dedicated budget, and it was co-developed with LMIC stakeholders. So we can make change. Some of them are incremental, but this is something that I hope changes the way in which we do research, the way we talk about research, and the way that we engage people. And with that, I would just like to thank you and acknowledge my wonderful lab that enables all of this work.